There's nothing quite so enticing as Ascendancy.
GGG, we're saving the best till last. Yep, last night we got the full reveal for the Legacy of Phrecia PoE1 event, and we also got the date. So it's going to be starting on the 20th of February, which is actually a Thursday, so not the Friday that I expected it to be, which was the 21st. But that's when it's going to be starting, and we also get the end date here, which I think may actually end up being extended. We'll actually have to see about that. But we have all 19 Ascendancies revealed now for this event, and yesterday we got the Scion Ascendancy, which is what this video is going to be all about, because that Ascendancy is just completely and utterly bonkers. So the new Scion Ascendancy is called the Scavenger, and here it is. So the Scavenger is basically taking uniques from all over the game, lots of different unique items, taking their special mechanics and then throwing them all into an Ascendancy and just seeing what sticks. Now, one of the first and really important things to note about this Ascendancy is the layout. So you start right here and you have to spend 2 points in your first lab, and you're likely just getting 2 passive points from these points here. We actually don't know what these small nodes are, but I'm assuming they're passive points. And then with your third Ascendancy point, you'll be able to spec into your first notable, and you get to choose from one of these nodes. And then you'll have to spend another 3 points either going up the top here or going down the bottom, which means you only have 2 points left over. So it means that you have to take this last cluster here, and you can never have a build that takes a notable from the top here and a notable from the bottom. So you must always have a build that paths over here to the left, grabs a node, and then goes like this, or goes like this. So first, let's cover this first cluster of notables here, and this is all about body armors. Beginning at the top here, we have Stasis Prison, 50% of damage taken recouped as life, and debuffs on you expire 50% faster. So first of all, the recoup is very high. 50% is a lot of recoup, and that's quite interesting there for some potential kind of recoup setups, full recoup setups, especially with self-damage. But I think the more notable modifier there is the debuffs on you expire 50% faster. Now, there is an item in the game called Beacon of Madness, and this one essentially provides some extremely powerful buffs. There's actually 3 different types there. So, for example, you got the Beacon of Madness, which makes all damage inflict poison, and it also has Chaos Explosions there as well. You got a different one which grants a large percentage of double damage and some maximum Fortify stacks. And you also have the Elemental Conflux version there, which also grants Elemental Ailment Immunity. And all of those really strong buffs are only available when you actually enter the Glorious Madness state, which is granted by the skill on these items. So what this skill actually does is over time, it continues to apply more and more debuffs on you. And these debuffs are incredibly punishing. You can actually see the debuffs here. It always grants one of these random debuffs per second. And each debuff lasts 20 seconds and can stack up to 10 times. And whenever you actually gain a new stack, it refreshes all of the stacks that you already have of that particular debuff. So for example, 6% increased damage taken per stack. This stacks up to 60% increased damage taken, which is obviously terrible. There's also 6% reduced action speed, so 60% potential reduced action speed. And there's some flask stuff there and life recovery rate. Really, really bad modifiers overall, and something that you absolutely do not want on your character for the most part. However, with this new source of debuffs expiring faster, you can potentially get this really, really low. I believe that you can get the duration of this 20 seconds down to around 2 or 3 seconds, which means that you should be able to have a setup where it essentially, on average, does not refresh these stacks. Now, of course, you are still going to be able to get unlucky there, where you actually do occasionally get one of these downsides picking the same one 2 or 3 or even 4 times in a row, but the chances of that happening is quite unlikely, and it means that you are going to be able to permanently stay in Glorious Madness and always have these powerful buffs up. So that is something interesting that you could look into, stacking the faster expiry rate of debuffs. Next up on this first notable here is Cloak of Flame, which is probably the most broken one on here. 40% of physical damage from hits taken as fire damage, which means that we are all the way back, several patches back, where we can get 100% physical damage taken as elemental. And this is only for hits, which is notable because the Cloak of Flame that we have in today's patch is also for damage over time. But still, with this node, you're going to be able to, equip Cloak of Flame there, and you can also equip a max rolled Dawnbreaker, and that means you're already at 100% physical damage taken as fire. You could instead choose to go for a Lightning Coil, for example, there for 50%. Remember that you don't want to actually go above 100% because that means that you're going to be taking more damage than you otherwise would have, because that's how damage taken as works. There is also one other notable thing there with this node. Because this is such a high amount of physical damage taken as elemental, it means that you can just use a crafted armor with Eldritch Implicit, as well as the helmet with Eldritch Implicit, and then a Dawnbreaker. That will still get you very, very high. You probably end up getting around 75 to 80% from that setup, and maybe even 85% depending on how you go about it. So, for example, on a body armor here, you could instead use the other kind of influence modifiers there, for example, Shaper modifiers, Elder modifiers, and these things, and these actually roll higher. These go up to 15% there on a normal roll and 18% on an elevated modifier, whereas the Eldritch Implicits there only go up to 12%. So if you actually go for using a normal influence body armor rather than an Ether and Exarch one, you can actually get a higher amount of physical damage taken as elemental. And that will mean that you can still benefit from all of those really powerful new base types that were added in the previous league, whilst still having a massive amount of physical damage taken as elementals. That's going to be really, really strong defensively. Next up, we have Fog Shade. This is a really strong one as well. 20% increased movement speed when on full life. Damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky while you are on full life. And 80% increased global evasion rating when on full life. So obviously this is extremely strong with Chaos Inoculation, because you're going to have all of these buffs up all the time, because with Chaos Inoculation you are always on full life with 1 out of 1 life. But another notable use case for this is just clicking this as soon as you can get it in the campaign. It's not going to be in the first lab, but it's going to be in the second lab, and that is just really nice because most of the time you are going to be on full life. You're gaining that 20% increased movement speed there. And there's also the 80% increased global evasion rating, which is also nice because it just means that you have a higher amount of evasion, so you're less likely to actually get hit and then get hit below full life. So you're able to keep that movement speed even more often. Next up, we have Shavron's Wrappings. This one is obviously very powerful. Chaos damage taken does not bypass Energy Shield. That means that you can forego the use of something like a Coruscating Elixir, which is a flask, of course, that has the same effect while it's active. And that means you don't have to have some kind of setup where you need to have this flask up all of the time, using the Traitor or something like that. And so you can use that setup with something like an Ivory Tower, very, very strong. And lastly, we have Blunderbore there, which is, the Shrine Stacking Armor. This is actually really strong, considering that Blunderbore is usually an item that you can't really equip on an average build. It has a massive strength requirement, and this just grants 40% increased effect of Shrine buffs on you. And you also have lesser Brutal Shrine and lesser Massive Shrine. So Brutal Shrine is 20% increased damage and knockback, and then the Massive Shrine there, the lesser Massive Shrine, is 20% increased area effect and 20% increased maximum life. So both of those buffs are going to be scaled up by this effect, and you're going to have 28% increased maximum life, 28% increased area effect, and 28% increased damage. But you do have knockback, which can be quite annoying sometimes. Now, before we move on to this other set of nodes here, which is actually on the opposite side, because this is one of the nodes you have to choose, you have to move through these other two. So let's actually discuss those ones first. So we're beginning with the top here, and the theme of this set of notables here is that they are all unique weapon modifiers. So beginning with Nycta's Lantern there, which is Battle Mage, and obviously anywhere that you're able to get Battle Mage is extremely strong without a kind of ridiculous downside. Obviously the downside is that you are choosing this compared to the other options. But Battle Mage is extremely strong in and of itself. It means that you gain added spell damage equal to the damage of your main hand weapon, and actually getting this modifier is very hard. There's only a few ways in the game. For example, you have to be an Inquisitor in the normal game to actually get this, or you need to use the helmet, which then prevents you from dealing critical strikes, or you actually need to use this unique weapon, which means that you then are in a bit of an awkward situation with your gear, and just getting this from an Ascendancy notable is very strong. We then have Cerberus Limb, which is a lot more defensive of a weapon. It's quite a nice setup actually that you could go for here. So 0.5% of spell damage leached as life if equipped shield has at least 30% chance to block. +1 to maximum energy shield per 5 armor on equipped shield. +5 to armor per 5 evasion rating on equipped shield, and +20 to evasion rating per 5 maximum energy shield on equipped shield. So this is a really nice node if you're using Aegis Aurora there, because you already meet that block cap, and you also gain a lot of stats because this has a high amount of armor and energy shield, which means that you, off this node, you actually gain a lot of evasion rating and a lot of maximum energy shield. And you could also consider using it there with Dawnbreaker, which once again has a high amount of block there and also a high amount of armor. So you would be gaining a bunch of maximum energy shield there, and you'd already be gaining the leech as well. However, I will say that I think that notable is one of the weaker ones on this setup here. So let's take a look at the other ones. We have Midnight Bargain there, which is a bunch of maximum minions. You have +3 to maximum phantasms, +1 to specters, +2 to raised zombies, +2 to skeletons, and +3 to summoned raging spirits. Now, I'm not really a minion guy, but one thing that is very notable about that node is Summon Raging Spirit of Enormity, which only has a maximum of 6 Raging Spirits, because they're much larger, they have more life, and they always deal critical strikes. This node would immediately increase that by 50%, so you go up to 9 maximum Raging Spirits, and that is quite strong, because Midnight Bargain is actually a weapon that is kind of difficult to use in any build, because it reserves life. You can see here is the replica Midnight Bargain, and the normal one also reserves life. So you just equip this, and you can't use it with Chaos Inoculation, right? You have to reserve 30% life. So this is very nice to get some extra minions there. And then we have Obliteration, or we just have the Explode modifier there from Obliteration. Enemies you kill have a 30% chance to explode, dealing a quarter of their maximum life as chaos damage. This is going to be a really nice option to grab just for mapping. You may even want to spec into this for mapping and spec into something else for bossing. And then we have one of the stronger options, or possibly the strongest option on this set of nodes, which is Void Battery. 25% increased spell damage per power charge, and +1 to maximum power charges. Now, the crazy thing about Void Battery is that the wand is kind of balanced around this modifier and this one here. So you have 80% reduced spell damage, and then you kind of counteract the reduced spell damage by getting a bunch of increased spell damage by stacking a ton of power charges. This reduction in spell damage here doesn't exist on the node. You can actually stack this with Void Battery or even 2 Void Batteries, and you could gain a massive amount of increased spell damage. For example, with 2 Void Batteries in this node, you would be having 750% increased spell damage at 10 power charges, which should be pretty trivial to get considering you're already getting +3 maximum just from those 3 parts. And that is an extremely strong option there. And then we have the Fulcrum, which is a really cool weapon, and actually seeing this on the Ascendancy took me back a little bit. That really surprised me, because the Fulcrum is actually a very hard weapon to use in a build. It's basically only being used in those Chieftain or, Juggernaut setups that do a similar thing, where they explode monsters to then inflict a massive ignite, which gets reflected to you. You're then immune to the ignite, but you're able to proliferate it around to nearby monsters. And that weapon is a 2-handed staff, and usually in those builds, it's not really used for anything else. You don't get any kind of damage from the weapon. It's literally just used for the ailment reflection, and you can just get that without having to use the weapon. That is absolutely crazy. So elemental ailments you inflict are reflected back to you. So some notable interactions that you may want to use with that, for example, is Winterweave. You inflict chill there, and then it gets reflected back to you. And if you inflict a 30% chill, you're getting a 30% chill reflected back to you, and that effect of chill is then being reversed. So you have 30% increased action speed. Something else you may want to do is use a skill to ignite, and then you can have that skill linked to ignite proliferation. And whenever the Fulcrum actually reflects an ailment back to you, any kind of effects that you actually apply to that ailment will also exist on the ailment that's reflected back to you. So it will actually have inherent ignite proliferation if that skill actually had that link to it when you cause that ignite. And that also means that if you're using Black Flame, the enemy that's suffering from that ignite will take chaos damage instead of fire damage from the ignite. And that also means that the reflected ignite onto you, you will take chaos damage from it. So you can run around igniting people with this ignite, and if you're using Chaos Inoculation, you take no damage from that ignite. So that's one interesting combination you could use there. So that is one of the weapon nodes. You have to take this one, which is kind of more of the caster angle, and the other one is more of the attack-oriented weapon nodes. So let's actually take a look at those ones. And we're beginning with Sinvictor's Mantle there, which is a Rampage Axe. And you're going to gain 2% increased area effect per 25 rage kills, gain a frenzy charge on every 50th rampage kill and rampage. Now this is a really nice node. Once again, it's one of those nodes that is going to feel great using it, particularly for mapping, but I think it's one of the weaker nodes here on these set of options. We also have Soul Taker there. Insufficient mana doesn't prevent your melee attacks, your physical damage can chill. Now this would have been extremely broken if they hadn't have nerfed Battle Mage's Cry in the last few patches. Battle Mage's Cry used to make a percentage of your spell damage apply to attack damage, and that's no longer the case. And now pretty much the only place that you can get that from is Crown of Eyes. And the reason why I say that is because you would have been able to do something with Indigon, where you basically spam your melee attack to be able to build up a bunch of increased spell damage, because the cost continues to ramp and you continuously build up spell damage. You can get up to 2,000 increased spell damage from this. And because your insufficient mana doesn't actually prevent those attacks, it means you can just continuously spam them to build up that spell damage. But then you can't actually use Crown of Eyes because you're using Indigon. However, one thing you could look at is actually scaling spell damage for another damage skill that doesn't spend mana. And an example of that is Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion. Modifiers to spell damage apply to this skill's damage over time effect. So that means that you can basically have Righteous Fire going and you can just be spamming an attack to build up a bunch of spell damage from Indigon, and that will scale the damage dealt by Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion. Next up we have Doomfletch, which is 20% of weapon physical damage as extra damage of each element. So that is extra damage, 20% of fire, 20% of cold, and 20% of lightning for a total of 60% extra damage. That is very, very nice. It's especially good on a physical bow. For example, if you craft a very good fizz bow, that's going to be really nice. And one other thing you could look at there is Pillar of the Caged God, in a strength stacking build using Bloodthirst to gain a bunch of flat physical added damage. And then you actually scale up that physical damage here, the weapon physical damage, and you gain a bunch of extra on top as elemental. Next is Oro's Sacrifice. I was pretty surprised to see this one here. So you gain Cutting Strike against burning enemies and gain a Frenzy Charge if an attack ignites an enemy. That is extremely strong to have on a node on the Ascendancy rather than having to use Oro's Sacrifice. Oro's is a decent weapon, but in this patch in particular, it has been so outclassed by crafted weapons that can also have runesmithing enchantments, and of course you can't get that runesmithing enchantment on Oro's Sacrifice. So being able to take this and play a Flicker Strike build, using a crafted weapon that also has a runesmithing enchantment, that is going to be extremely powerful. And then we have Starforge. Your physical damage can shock, 20% increased area effect for attacks. This is just a kind of standardly good node. There's nothing completely broken about this, but just being able to inflict shock with physical damage is kind of crazy. You could see this in a slam build, for example, like an Earth Shatter build. Being able to scale up your area effects, hit a larger area, and also inflict a shock, which potentially makes the target take up to 50% increased damage. Lastly, we have Tarfor's Felling there, which is trigger level 20 Tarfor's Chosen when you attack, with a non-vow, slam, or strike skill near an enemy. Now, this is a node which used to be on the Chieftain and was then moved to a unique item, this mace right here. This mace is kind of mediocre, it doesn't do very much damage, it has a slow attack speed, and being able to get this skill on an Ascendancy is once again very strong. This has a 1 second cooldown, and how it works is that whenever it actually procs, you're basically summoning a Mirage, which is an entity that then uses your attack for you. It kind of uses it again, so it's basically a repeat of an attack, and it uses your attack with all of the support gems linked to it. So it gains all of that damage, actually uses a full attack, as long as the supports can actually apply to it, or the scaling damage can actually apply to it. So for example, Fist of War support does not work because that only applies to skills that you use yourself. And things like Warcry Exerts also do not work because they only exert your attacks. So keep that in mind whenever you're thinking about using this and actually scaling the damage, but that is actually still extremely strong. And remember, this works with slams and strikes, so you can really do whatever you want with that. And once you've either gone through this node here or this one, you then reach the back here. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to take one of these nodes here because you can't take one of these and one of these, so you're always going to path round to get to this one. And the theme of this node is essentially a bunch of really strong jewelry modifiers, most of which are amulets. and some of them are kind of busted, which is basically the theme of this Ascendancy, right? So we've got Tainted Pact up here. Taking chaos damage over time heals you instead while leeching life. That is completely crazy. Tainted Pact is quite a weak amulet overall. You really don't want to be using this amulet too much, but the only reason why you do use it is because this modifier right here is extremely busted. And with this, for example, you're going to be able to make use of Petrified Blood to be able to then gain Overleech, or you could make use of Immortal Ambition or Soul Tether to gain that keystone as well. And when you actually have Overleech, you're going to be able to benefit from this modifier most of the time. And you can then use the Golden Rule along with a moderate amount of chaos resistance, so you probably want to have around 20% or something like that. And whenever you actually inflict a poison, it gets reflected back to you, and instead of that dealing damage to you, it heals you. And obviously, the lower amount of chaos resistance you have, the more damage it would have dealt, and therefore the more heal it actually provides. So that can be extremely strong. You can gain a ridiculous amount of recovery doing that. Then we have Fury Valve there, which, just like Tainted Pact, is a pretty weak amulet, but if you're using a build, for example, if you're doing Ice Shot or Splitting Steel, then you're going to be able to use this without having to use the Fury Valve amulet, which once again means you can use a much stronger crafted amulet in its place. We also have the Edrade's Tongue there, which I think is probably the weakest on this set of modifiers. Cursed enemies cannot inflict elemental ailments on you. Possibly nice early on in a Hex Blast build or something like that, but this is generally pretty weak. And Xerfe's Heart there is also a little bit weak, I'd say, overall. Again, could be useful in something like Hex Blast, but it is quite niche. And then we have Leadership's Price there, which is not weak at all. This is actually very strong. You have Scorching Conflux, Brittle Conflux, and Sapping Conflux, while your two highest attributes are equal. Cannot inflict, ignite, chill, freeze, or shock. So it prevents you from inflicting the normal ailments in favour of the alt ailments there. And Conflux means that all of your damage actually inflicts those ailments. So it doesn't matter what damage type you're dealing, all of it will actually inflict those ailments. Now, one thing to mention here is that actually Leadership's Price can be a really good amulet. So Leadership's Price can provide +3 to all maximum elemental resistances, but each of these roll on a separate layer and this item drops corrupted, which means that it's typically extremely expensive to get a very good version of Leadership's Price. But I thought I'd mention that there because that is kind of an interesting difference between this node here and the others up here, is that Leadership's Price can actually be a really good amulet and an amulet that you may actually want in your build. So potentially you could actually take this early on if you're looking to make a build around this, and then later on when you actually acquire a really good Leadership's Price, you could replace your amulet with that and then spec out of this and go for something else. Lastly, we have Death's Rush for this list of notables here. Gain Adrenaline for 5 seconds on kill. This is probably the strongest one in this selection here. This is actually just really nice. Adrenaline is such a strong buff. 100% increased damage, 25% increased attack, cast, and movement speed, and 10% additional PDR. And you're going to have this up almost 100% of the time in a mapping environment. But it is an on-kill modifier, which means that you're going to have to find some shenanigans to actually have this during bossing. You can do that, though. You could use something like Penance Mark, for example, to spawn those phantasms. But this is really, really strong. I expect to see quite a few Scion builds taking this early on, even if they're going to spec out of it later on. This is just so strong for mapping. And overall, this Ascendancy is completely wild. This is easily the most crazy Ascendancy of all of them. And I do expect to see a lot of people logging into the Scion Scavenger event start on Thursday, next Thursday, the 20th of February. What do you guys think of this crazy Ascendancy? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.